for coming out here today and joining us as we make, I think, an important announcement for the city of Charleston and our ability to be able to fund the hundreds of millions or billions of dollars of drainage and flood improvements that are needed in our city. But first, I wanted to remind you that it was on this site just about 3 years ago, I think tomorrow will be 3 years ago, that Hurricane Irma was impacting Charleston. And it's high tide now, and you can see just over the rail here that the water ain't far down, even right now. Hurricane Irma, if you remember those pictures and that footage, the city of Charleston and the harbor, the Atlantic Ocean, had become one. And water just spread throughout this region of our city. And in fact, that flooding was impacted by climate change and sea level rise that's occurring on our planet. You know, we've been measuring sea level here in the harbor of Charleston for over 100 years. They just started doing it back then and kept it up. And during that time, sea level rise has risen over a foot. Now, that may not sound like a whole lot right now over that period of time, but here's the thing. In the last 20 years, with the climate change that's occurred, and mostly because of the burning of fossil fuels, the rate of increase has quadrupled. It's rising 4 times faster now than it was over that period of time. So very reasonably, we expect, and this information comes to us scientifically through NOAA and other organizations, that it's documented that the expectation is here in Charleston Harbor, by the year 2070, in the next 50 years, we'll see an additional 2 to 3 feet of sea level rise. Now you can see where the sea level is right now, just at high tide. Another 3 feet, and the whole lower half of the peninsula, or major portion of it, would be flooded. And so that's why we're going through major expense here to elevate the low battery. And eventually we'll have to protect the entire perimeter of the peninsula and other parts of our city. In addition to sea level rise, what climate change has done, it's impacted the weather of our planet. We see it even in the fires that are occurring out west. But notably, right here in Charleston in the last 5 years, you've seen what we call the 1,000-year storm. Hurricane Matthew, Hurricane Irma, as I just mentioned, Hurricane Michael, Hurricane Florence. This past year, the scare and scrape from Hurricane Isaias. So in addition to extreme weather, as I mentioned, we have the sea level rise. So the difference that's made, now when I was a little boy growing up in Charleston, not far from here, it was recorded, I think, 5 days in the mid-60s, Councilmember Waring, that high tide was high enough that it actually flowed over on the streets. So did y'all know in 2019 that happened 89 times in the city of Charleston? And by the year 2050, it's estimated that that occurrence could happen every other day. So our staff, and one reason I have Councilmember Keith Waring with us today, he's chairman of our Public Works Committee, and they oversee all these projects like the one behind me. And do you know what our staff had estimated cost to be for all the needed projects to address stormwater in the city of Charleston over the next couple of decades? Close to $2 billion. We are filing a lawsuit today against Big Oil. And the reason is they have contributed through a intentional deception to change the story of the impact of the burning of fossil fuels on climate change on this planet. So I feel it's not fair to the citizens in Charleston to have to bear the burden, the total cost of these improvements that are needed because of sea level rise. The oil companies clearly knew this as far back as the 1960s. It's amazing. And then they realized they needed to change the narrative. And so they engaged in an intentional campaign of deception. They lied. They lied to us about the impact of their products on climate change and that it would lead to sea level rise. They even predicted within, I think, 1/10 of a degree what the rise in temperature would be over a 50-year period. The oil companies did it themselves. So this lawsuit we are filing today shows that these companies have known for more than 50 years that their products were going to cause the worst flooding that this world has seen since Noah built the ark. And instead of warning us, they covered up the truth and turned our flooding problems into their profits. That was wrong. And this lawsuit is all about holding them accountable for this multi-decade campaign of deception and sharing the burden of cost for what they have brought upon us. I'd like to call on Councilmember Waring to share with you even more about the projects that we're engaged in across the city, in all parts of the city. And Councilmember Waring, he's chairman of our Public Works Committee.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. The fact points that the mayor gave isn't almost correct. It's 100% correct. If you look at this particular case, it parallels what tobacco did to a community, to a country, and to a world. The cost to put in the fixes should not be borne by the City of Charleston residents alone. It's a cost that should be shared. We're here at the iconic Battery, but the City of Charleston has public work projects, drainage projects going on in virtually every part of the city, from Cane Hoy all the way to Johns Island and everything in between. But the cost is daunting. Can we do it by ourselves? We can't. It's getting to the point to where we refer to them as rain bombs. You know, when you get 3-4 inches of rain in about 4 or 5 hours, you'd be surprised at the amount of people that don't realize, where does the drainage go from my street? It eventually leads to the river or a creek. But when the sea level rises and a rain bomb occurs, that pipe is full with water. So it backs up. It's like dominoes. It backs up from that river or that creek into your street, into your neighborhood, maybe even into your home. So how do we go about fixing that? The City of Charleston is engaged right now in hundreds of millions of dollars in drainage repairs and what we call stormwater repairs. We see them every day, and they become second nature. You see them, as you say, right behind us. If you go to the September Clark Park, where you're going to see them. If you go out at Bees Ferry Road, which is maybe 15 miles from here, Johns Island, James Island. A meeting last night, we probably spent, don't you think, Mr. Mayor, over an hour or more talking about one major drainage area off of Central Park Road. Citizens want answers, and they're deserving of answers, and believe it or not, the public servants want to provide those answers. So, Mr. Mayor, I appreciate stepping forward in the leadership and bringing forth this leadership with our legal staff. And our citizens need to know that we're behind them because they're behind us. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilmember. We also have Susan Herdina, our legal counsel, available to ask any questions you may have about the lawsuit, along with Councilmember Waring and myself. Any questions?
What exactly are you trying to recoup financially from this lawsuit?
Well, the lawsuit specifies the different areas of costs and expenses, but most notably the expenses of doing just like you see behind us, which I've estimated to be at $2 billion. The lawsuit itself doesn't specify a dollar amount, but instead has about 6 or 7 categories of expenses. I don't know if you want to add any detail to that, Susan.
That's correct, and we're asking for the cost of the damage that has occurred to the city as a we're asking for the cost for the damage to the city as a result of the defendant's conduct. There is no dollar amount that's specified in the complaint at that time. At this time, that'll be evidence that'll come out through the jury process.
And I know Charleston will be the 21st city to join a lawsuit of this kind. Municipalities around the nation. How have those efforts gone?
At this point, they're in their very early stages. You've probably been doing some research on it. There's cases that have been filed by municipalities and states on both the West Coast and the East Coast, arguing basically the same thing as we're saying here. They're very early on. The defendants are vigorously opposing these lawsuits, as you can imagine, and so it will take some time to get through this process, but we can wait. Yeah. Thank you.
And Mayor, is this something that you've been thinking about for a long time now?
Well, I'd say for at least a year, but it really struck me over the last few years as we continued to have storm after storm, this extreme weather that's related to climate change, and then the realization of the sea level rise right here in Charleston. And of course, we've been working on these issues over the last few years. So as that's all percolated, so to speak, and looking for ways to bring accountability to those who are at fault and to help provide relief to the citizens of Charleston, it's just not fair to me that they have to shoulder the entire burden of these kinds of protections against sea level rise when it was really conducted on a global scale, number one, but more importantly, that there was an intentional path of deception to keep the public from knowing, even though the oil companies knew what was happening.
And would you say we're at the point of no return? These projects have to happen.
Absolutely. It's an existential threat to our city. If we don't act now, and we are, the future of our city is in jeopardy. Robert?
How does the existence of this lawsuit change what you plan to do as far as pursuing these projects and pursuing other sources of money for these projects?
Well, let's just say if we're successful, it will accelerate the timeline at which we will be able to complete all the projects that we are prioritized to, that we know need to be done in order to address this challenge.
Will it cause you to back away maybe from some other ideas you've been pursuing, such as the use of hospitality taxes and things?
Not at all. Not at all. In fact, I hear we had some success with that matter in the legislature this week. It came out of a House committee, and we're still hopeful to be able to use hospitality and accommodations taxes more freely for drainage improvements. So when it's like building the Ravenel Bridge, which was at the time a $500 or $600 million project. You can't fund $2 billion worth of improvements by one pocket, and that primary pocket, of course, to date has been the taxpayers of Charleston and the Charleston region. And we must find as many ways as possible to shoulder this debt, to shoulder this burden, so that we can protect our city in the long haul. This is one way to do it.
You spoke about being willing to wait and that this is going to take some time to go through, but are we looking at months, years until we potentially see this money if the lawsuit is successful? What does the timeline look like?
That's a very good question, and I don't want to speculate. Hopefully the defendants will be reasonable and we can resolve this quickly, but I am not optimistic that that will happen based upon what I've seen in other jurisdictions. Like I said, there's a lot of money at stake here for them, and they are going to vigorously defend the case, but I feel strongly we've looked at the evidence, we've got the scientific evidence to connect the dots, and I think the city has a very strong case here. So we look forward to meeting the defendants in court.
What support from City Council? Do you have support from the rest of the City Council and City Council? We're in here, but what have you heard from other members of City Council on this?
I'm going to refer that question to Councilmember Waring.
Well, so I'm one of 12, but I think we have solidarity on this. You can't.
Might want to wait.
That's the sound of freedom up there, by the way. You can't go in any city council district and one councilman say, I don't have a drainage problem in my district. I don't have any of my constituents that doesn't have the threat of being flooded. And one of the most precious assets they have is their home, where they raise their families. I mean, this is an intimate problem, and it takes a broad solution, as the mayor has said, and certainly our council has said. What we want is these companies to be fair in addressing the damages, frankly, that they know they caused. We're not accusing them of something they don't know that they've done. So that sums it up. They did it. We all have to help pay for it, inclusive of them. Thank you.
And to clarify, you said the city is currently spending about $2 billion on current flood mitigation and drainage projects?
That was an estimate that was done. Currently, we're spending some hundreds of millions, but $2 billion would be a figure that would probably take well over a decade for us to accomplish.
Obviously, there's a large potential payoff here if the city gets money from the oil companies for this work. Is the city having to commit any money to bring this lawsuit, or is it essentially being handled by the law firms bringing it?
This, I think the proper term is this case is being handled on a contingency. So there's no direct expense to the city until we have a successful outcome. Well, great. Thank you all for being out here today and understanding the great need for this in our city and community and the critical nature of it all. Thank you very much for being with us.